Hey guys, I'm very excited about this lecture because in this lecture we get to talk all about skin. Skin, the integumentary system. Very important, right? All of us are covered in skin, but skin is more than skin deep. It does a lot of functions, has a lot of intricacies to it, so we're going to try to break it down, learn its functions, learn its intricacies, and I think you'll, by the end of this, hopefully, if I've done my job right, find skin almost as fascinating as I do. Let's see. So check it out, the integumentary system. And you've already learned about epithelial tissue, but we're going to take it literally to the next level now and learn all the parts of the skin. And you'll see it comes in layers, and each of these layers has specific functions. So let's get a basic introduction into the integument. And of course, another name for the integument is the skin. Now, how many of you knew that the integument is the largest organ in the body? So your skin is an organ because, like all organs, it's made of tissues. Tissues are made of cells, and these cells work together for specific functions. Now, there's actually two main layers to the skin. One is the outer layer, and it's called the epidermis, and it consists of stratified squamous epithelium. So you already know from our discussion of tissues what stratified squamous epithelium is. We already said squamous cells are kind of flat, so these are your squamous cells. Of course, they each have a nucleus, but they're in multiple layers, and that's what makes it stratified. So the epidermis, epi of course means upon, dermis just means skin. So the epidermis is the layer that consists of stratified squamous epithelium. Now, below the epidermis would be the dermis, right? So if epi means upon the dermis, dermis is the layer below the epidermis. And you've already learned about connective tissues. So some of these terms might ring a bell. Remember areolar connective tissue and dense irregular connective tissue. Well, those are the tissues that are going to make up the dermis. So we're going to look at this in bigger detail, but just taking a look at this picture over here. Okay, so two layers, the epidermis, and below that, made of connective tissue, the dermis. So we said that we can have several layers of stratified squamous in the epidermis, and as you'll learn in a little bit, not all of the cells in these stratified layers are alive. So if I outline the bottom of the epidermis here as best as I can using this pen, okay, it looks like a drunken driver here, but you can see that the first few layers are living cells, and as they move up into the epidermis, they start to age, and by the end, all these top layers over here are dead cells and the protein keratin that they produce. So we're going to break each of these layers down a little more, but those would be, that whole area there would be the epidermis. Changing colors again here, let's make it green. I'm just going to kind of color in the dermis area here. So all this is connective tissue beneath that epidermis. So that is the dermis. Now, not shown on this picture, but below all of that is another region that is technically not part of the integument, and that is called the hypodermis. And you know the prefix hypo means below, so this would be below the dermis. And this is your subcutaneous fat, your subcutaneous tissue. It consists of a lot of adipose connective tissue and therefore has a lot of fat cells in it. Now, you already know, what does fat do? Well, it's a shock absorber, so it's going to help, when somebody pokes you, that fatty layer is going to protect you. It also is an insulator, so it's going to help us to maintain homeostasis with regards to body temperature. But technically, it's not part of the integument, although we tend to talk about all of these together. So what are the functions of the integument, of the skin? Well, skin is fascinating because, you already know that your skin protects you, right? I mean, this is our outer covering. This is the first barrier to pathogens that might come around, bacteria, viruses, fungi, things that you do not want in your body. A lot of these guys will just go boing, boing, boing. They can't get in there because your skin is protecting you. But that is not all skin does. It does a whole lot of other things. It prevents us from dehydrating, so it prevents water loss, because as you'll learn, your skin has a coating of lipids as well as proteins like keratin that are going to help to kind of waterproof us. You're going to get a nice waterproofing layer on the outside. So for example, if I were to spray myself with some water, it'll kind of bead up and fall off. So you already know your water to an extent is waterproof. Maybe a better term would be water resistant, right? If you sit in a bath too long, eventually you'll start to look like a prune. But it is helping to not only keep too much water from going in, but it keeps too much water from going out. So if it wasn't for that water resistant property of our skin, we'd have to be consuming water 24/7 or we would just completely dehydrate. Now, you might already know that the skin also functions for temperature regulation, and it does this in a number of ways. So we already talked about the hypodermis with the fatty layer, and that of course helps to keep some warmth in, but sometimes we get too hot, right? Especially on a hot summer day, and so we need to have a mechanism for cooling off, and the skin allows us to do that because, as we'll find out later, the skin contains glands, and some of those glands, called Merocrine glands, we'll learn that in a little bit, produce sweat. So they secrete sweat, and that sweat is kind of like a nice cool drink of water over your skin. It's going to help to allow heat to dissipate off of our body and therefore allow us to cool off. And so sweating is a very, very important mechanism. Not all mammals do it. So, you know, like a dog, it's got to pant instead. But we humans are fortunately evolved to be able to use our skin to regulate temperature through sweating. But it also does things like helping to metabolize pathogens. So for example, you have certain enzymes in your cells of your skin called lysozymes. And I'm just going to write that here, lysozymes. That's an O right there, lysozymes. Zymes, there we go. I don't have my electric pen today, so I'm having to use this one on the PowerPoint. So lysozymes are enzymes that, like most enzymes, break things down. So if a bacterial cell happens to try to penetrate your skin and gets in there even a little bit, the lysozymes can be secreted, and that will perforate the cell walls of the bacteria, and their insides will kind of ooze out, and the bacterial cell will be defeated. So in that sense, it also plays a role in immune defense. So we got lysozymes. The other thing that can be secreted from your skin are antibodies, and that's the abbreviation for the protein antibodies. So antibodies, as you know, are proteins that circulate through our system that recognize particular pathogens. And so as soon as one of those pathogens tries to make its way in, these antibodies are like soldiers, and they go boom, or mark them so that other things can gobble them up. So our skin plays a very important immune defense, and in fact, it's kind of our first line of immune defense when a bad guy, like a pathogen, tries to get in. The other thing is your skin serves a sensory reception role. And the physiology of sensory reception is actually quite complicated, but absolutely fascinating, but kind of beyond the scope of this particular lecture. However, you'll note that in the dermis of your skin, you have the endings of nerve cells. And these nerve cells are able to detect things like pain or pressure, pleasure, all sorts of sensory feelings, and they can pick up those sensations and send signals to the central nervous system to say, hey, you know, if you're touching a sharp object, you better move your finger out of the way. And so the skin is the first thing that will tell your central nervous system that there's a problem that needs to be acted upon. So really, really important functions that the integument has. Now, I don't know if you can see on this picture, but this is kind of going over the two layers of the integument plus the hypodermis, which is your subcutaneous layer. And notice that the epidermis is actually divided into 5 different layers. So we're going to go over each of these layers in some detail. The dermis is itself divided into 2 layers, the papillary layer and the reticular layer, and we'll go over each of those. So notice just in this picture, you can see that the epidermis are squamous cells and proteins that they secrete, and then there's a few other kinds of cells in there. But the dermis and the hypodermis are much busier places. So we're going to have blood vessels in there. We're going to have glands, nervous tissue. Of course, the hypodermis has the fat tissue. So these are things that you do not find in the epidermis. And finally, we could say that the integument also has an excretion-secretion function, because as we said, it produces sweat, it's producing lysozymes and antibodies, it produces a lipid and a protein secretion. So there's a lot of excretory and secretory functions that it has as well, and we'll go into those in more detail. So this gives you a nice picture, a diagram of a section of skin. So let's just go over the main parts here, and then some of these will go into more detail. So, wow, skin is a busy place, isn't it? You know, like I said, skin's not just skin deep, it's a busy place. So going from the top down, all of this down here is the epidermis. Okay, so all of this is the epidermis. The part up here is where you're getting to the dead skin cells that contain keratin. So that's mostly a keratin layer. Your living cells of the epidermis are over here. But this little layer here, which has these little waves below the epidermis, is called your papillary layer. Now you hear the term papilla or papillary a lot through anatomy physiology, because papilla means nipple. You're like, nipple? What are nipples doing in my skin? Well, it's just the shape. So, you know, these little waves here kind of look like little nipples. And so this is the papillary layer because of the nipples. Ah, you learn something new every day, huh? And so that's the topmost layer of the dermis. And underneath that, all of this stuff here is the lower layer of the dermis called the reticular layer. And all reticular means is network. So I think we talked about this when we were talking about tissues. We talked about reticular tissue. So you hear reticula or reticular a lot in anatomy physiology. So you learn these terms early, your life will be so much easier later on. And then, of course, down here is your subcutaneous layer that are known as your hypodermis. And do I dare try to use this writing tool here on my laptop to write this out? I don't know whether that will help you or hurt you here. So I'm just going to put hypodermis, D-E-R. You're going to write this on your paper faster than I can write it here. D-E-R-M-I-S. So that is your hypodermis. So let's see what we got here. Now notice you got some things sticking out of here. Woo-hoo-hoo, look at this. That is a hair. How cool is that? That is a hair. And the little thing sticking out is the hair shaft. It's the shaft of the hair, right? Think if I have a pen. This is a pen. This is the pen shaft, right? That's all that means. So, and then where that hair shaft extends from is the little bulbous area here called a hair bulb, or the whole thing would be called the hair follicle. So you got hair sticking out of your skin. What else do you got sticking out of your skin? Ah, look here. You guys know about your pores, right? Let me see if I can show my pores in the camera. I got lots of them, lots of pores. Older you get, the more your pores show, right? So we have pores, we have openings in our skin, and those are important because they allow things to come out. So right here is part of a gland. That's a sweat gland, and the opening would be a sweat pore. So that is a sweat gland called a Merocrine gland. We'll look at that in more detail. Here's the rest of it here. So notice the bottom of the gland itself is just this like squiggly thing of tubes, and that is where the sweat is produced. So you have cells in your Merocrine gland, and in fact they're epithelial cells, and they're producing sweat, and that sweat will come up the tube and out the sweat pore, and guess what? You are sweating at that point. So that is your Merocrine sweat gland, and we'll go over that again in a little bit. Oh, what else do we have here? Okay, so you know that this is a hair shaft, but check this out. Some of those hairs right next to them and feeding into them have another kind of gland, and this is called a sebaceous gland. It's also called an oil gland or a halocrine gland. So we'll go over these glands later on as well. But sebaceous glands secrete sebum, which is like this oily substance. It's kind of nasty when you think about it. But that oil gets secreted right into the place, the shaft, where the hair is coming out. And so, you haven't washed your hair in a while and it gets all greasy. Yeah, that's because of the sebum, the oil that's being secreted by the sebaceous glands into your hair shaft. What else do we got here? Oh, check this out. Look at this thing right here. This is a muscle. It's a muscle in your skin. How many of you knew you had muscle inside your skin? It's actually in the dermis, and that is a smooth muscle. And it's smooth, meaning it's under involuntary control. You can't consciously make it move. But when you're all emotional, or you're scared, like you walk into a haunted house, or like right now when it's really cold, I don't know if you guys can see that. Can you see my hair standing up on end on my skin? I have goosebumps right now because it's really cold in this room. So this muscle also responds to cold. So fear, cold, embarrassment, that causes this muscle, and it's called an erector pili muscle. It causes that erector pili muscle to contract, and because it's attached to your skin hair, boing, it actually causes your skin hair to become erect, to stand up straight. So that's why my hair is standing up straight on my arm, which I know that means my erector pili muscles are contracted. They are in gear. So, and goosebumps, what exactly are the goosebumps? Well, when that muscle is contracted, it actually causes your epidermis to kind of crinkle up a little bit. And that's what that goosebump is. It's your crinkled skin because that erector pili muscle is contracted. How cool is that? Okay, what else do we have in the dermis here? Well, we already said we have nerves. So here is a sensory nerve fiber, and you can see it's showing them kind of all over the place around here. So the hairs themselves and the cells themselves can actually, when you get some kind of pressure point there, it sort of sends out a force, a wave of sensation that will hit the ends of these nerve fibers and send that nerve impulse. You'll learn later when we do the nervous system that a nerve impulse is called an action potential. And it'll send that action potential through the nerve fiber and out to your central nervous system, where it can make a decision about what kind of sensation that is. Is it one you need to worry about, or is it one that you might want more of? Who knows? So anyway, you have sensory nerve fibers in your dermis. Another kind of gland you have is called an apocrine sweat gland. And it's not going to be found in all parts of your skin, just certain parts of your skin. As you'll learn later, apocrines are found in stinky places. Armpits, anuses, nipples, your areolar around the nipples, groin, anyway, places like that. So we'll get into that a little bit later. And of course, you have blood vessels. And the blood vessels are very important, veins and arteries, and the tributaries from there, venules and capillaries. And why do you need blood vessels in your dermis? Well, the cells that are in your epidermis do not have blood vessels, but they still have to eat. They have to have oxygen, they have to have nutrients, and so we have to have a way to get those things to those epidermal cells, and thankfully there are blood vessels right below the epidermis, and that will carry those important things to them. And then, of course, we said the hypodermis, the subcutaneous layer. You have adipose connective tissue, so that's all the yellow stuff here. You guys know adipose connective tissue. You're experts on it by now. As well as interspersed areolar, or if you prefer areolar, connective tissue. And what kind of connective tissue is areolar? You know that. It's loose connective tissue. It's loose, lots of ground substance, scattered collagen and elastic fibers and fibroblasts and that kind of stuff. So you find that kind of connective tissue in the hypodermis. So when you're looking at a specimen under the microscope of skin, pay attention to where on the specimen you are when you're looking at it. Are you in the hypodermal layer? Are you in the dermal layer? Are you in the epidermal layer? Because otherwise, people have a tendency to get lost, and there's nothing worse than being lost when you're looking through a microscope. Okay, so let's go into more detail on the epidermis itself. So this is the most superficial layer, and you'll recall superficial means shallow, close to the outer surface. In a sense, your epidermis is also an epithelial layer, right? It's a stratified squamous epithelial. So I'm going to attempt to trace the epidermis here. Okay, so here is, between my little green lines here is the epidermis. So that's the most superficial layer. We already said it's avascular. That means there's no blood vessels, no veins, no arteries, no tributaries of veins or arteries in there. It relies on the blood vessels in the dermis to get the nutrients. And it's keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. Keratinized. So the epidermis has cells called keratinocytes that produce the protein keratin. Sometimes that protein is also called cytokeratin. So depending on the book you're using, you might see one or the other. Keratin is a very interesting protein. It's very diverse. Your hair is made out of it. Your nails are made out of it. The horns of rhinoceri are made out of keratin. And the outer part of your epidermis is all keratin. So what happens is, as these keratin-producing cells, the keratinocytes produce the keratin, that keratin is pretty much just going towards the outer, most superficial part of the epidermis. So all of this on the outside is pretty much pure keratin. The cells at that point are dead. Okay, so keratin is a water-insoluble protein. So this helps with that waterproofing property of our skin. If it wasn't for the keratin, water could probably seep in or out anytime at once. And so the epidermis has 4 to 5 layers, and the fancy term for a layer is strata, plural, or stratum, singular. And so the epidermis is 4 to 5 layers of distinct cell types, and we're going to go over each of these. But let me, before I forget, write out the word, or attempt to write out the word with this pen, keratinocyte, because that is an important word. That is the kind of cells that are producing the keratin. So that's making up the bulk of the epidermis. This is actually going better than I thought. Keratin, that's the protein. But then it's a cell, so we're going to say oocyte. And you know that cyte refers to cell. So the keratinocytes are producing the keratin. Okay, so here are the 5 layers, the 5 strata of the epidermis. So your skin, you have epidermis and dermis, and then below your skin you have a hypodermis, but within the epidermis there's 5 different layers. So again, it's not just skin deep, it's pretty complicated. So let's go over all of these, and depending on the book you're using, some of them will have multiple names, but let's just go with the names that I have here. So what I have over here is a section of the epidermis. So notice the dermis is at the bottom. We're going to outline the epidermis again. So I'm going to trace it along here. So this is my epidermis, and all the way, of course, to the top. So all of this between my kind of ugly green line here is the epidermis. So let's see if we can identify the layers. So the very bottom layer of cells, so I'm outlining those guys here. The very bottom of that layer is the basement layer. And the fancy term in Latin for the basement layer is basale. So stratum is the layer, it's the basement layer. So it's the stratum basale. So say that with me, stratum basale. Okay, so that's the bottommost layer. And that is also the youngest layer. This is where the baby cells are, the newbies. These baby cells are fresh and they're happy, and they're going to start migrating up towards the outer, most superficial layer as they age. So these guys are not producing a lot of keratin at this point. They're just getting started with their life. And of course, the lower side of this stratum basale is your basement membrane. So you already learned from last time what a basement membrane is. That's really the membrane that forms the barrier between that layer of cells and what lies below it. And you'll remember the basement membrane has a lot of polysaccharides and proteins in it. Okay, moving on up, we got the stratum spinosum. So that can be several layers thick of cells. So, and unfortunately, this diagram does not do these spinosum cells justice, because by the time the cells have migrated from the stratum basale to the stratum spinosum, cool stuff has started to happen. They look different. So I'm going to attempt to draw some here. By the time they're in the stratum spinosum, spinosum means spiny. So this is the spiny layer. They start to kind of look like stars or something like that. And so the reason why is because they've started to lose water. So, when they lose water, they kind of shrivel up. But the other thing that happens in the stratum spinosum is these cells start to connect with each other. They're forming nice connections. So let's see, if I change the color here to yellow, I'm going to represent that with these little marks right here. And those are cell connections, intercellular junctions, and you might remember one kind of intercellular junction is called a desmosome. Desmosome. O-M-E. Desmosome. So the desmosome are protein connections between the cells that allow for communication. So these guys are forming nice tight complexes between themselves. So they're getting a nice, kind of like a fortress, right? So these are the desmosomes. The cells themselves have started to lose water. You also start to see some other kinds of cells starting in the stratum basale and then continuing. So for example, this little guy here that looks like a little splat of paint, that is a tactile cell, so he's going to help to receive some of the force from some kind of tactile sensation, like a pushing. We also have this guy right here. This is an epidermal dendritic cell. Okay, so you'll have those guys sitting in there. And notice it's a little bit hard to see where exactly they're referring to. It's right here. This guy is a melanocyte. And melanocytes, you've probably heard of. They produce the protein melanin, which is responsible for giving skin a dark appearance. So people with darker skin have more melanin being produced, but they actually don't have any more melanocytes. We all pretty much have the same number of melanocytes. They just have more melanin being produced. So let's go over the next most superficial layer, and that is this darker layer here. This is called the stratum granulosum. And granulosum means granulated. So these guys actually, their cells, imagine this is my cell, by the time it reaches this layer, it started producing little granules that contain proteins. And because of the granules, it gets this nice kind of darker appearance. So it's pretty easy to distinguish it from the stratum spinosum below and the layers above. Moving on up, you'll see this. See if you can see this. It's kind of hard to see because it's kind of transparent. It's kind of clear. Now, if you're talking about thin skin, like you find in your arm or your face, this layer here is practically non-existent to the eye. This is called the stratum lucidum. The place where you really see the stratum lucidum is in thick skin, like you find on the palms of your hands or the soles of your feet. And lucidum, lucid, it means clear or light. So it's very, very light. It looks like it's transparent under a light microscope. And the reason why it looks transparent is because it consists of dead cells. So by the time your cells have migrated all the way up to the stratum lucidum, they are dead. They have aged, they are dead. All the organelles are gone, the nucleus is gone, and so they just look like ghosts. They're just empty little cell blobs. But they are still producing protein. So the keratin by then is oozing out, and so by the time you get to the most superficial layer, well, that was a bad line, called the stratum corneum, all of this is dead cells and keratin. So it's the keratin that's left behind. And you'll have other cells that will also produce some kind of lipid substance to help with that waterproofing. But again, that outermost layer is dead keratinocytes with the keratin protein. So if you look back at the picture, notice in this particular picture, instead of saying stratum basale, they say stratum germinativum, means the germinating layer. It's the same layer, so don't get confused if you see different names for that. But check out the stratum corneum. I mean, it's huge. It's many, many layers of cells thick, but those cells are dead, and so what you're seeing here is the keratin that was produced. How cool is that? Okay, so again, just to recap, the stratum basale is only one layer. It's young cells because they are undergoing cell division, which you remember is called mitosis. And that stratum basale is going to have keratinocytes, which are starting to produce keratin, but they haven't really gone in full force yet. You'll see melanocytes, which are producing the dark pigment. So check these out. These are actual melanocytes that are making that dark color there. Aren't those cool? And if you zoom out, see how that's nice and dark right there? Those are those melanocytes producing melanin. Now, the function of melanin, you probably know, is to absorb UV radiation. So people whose ancestors were from areas where there's a lot of sunlight tend to have darker skin because there's more UV radiation, and so it would be an advantageous adaptation to produce more melanin against that. Because you don't want UV radiation getting in there and screwing up your DNA and causing skin cancer. People whose ancestors come from more northerly areas, there's not as much UV radiation produced, and so producing melanin is energetically costly. Evolutionary rule of things is if you don't use it, you lose it. So put your energy to where it's used, not where it's not used. And then also in your stratum basale, you'll have those sensory cells, those tactile cells. So that's just kind of a sum up over there. To recall what kinds of cells you'll find in the stratum basale. Stratum spinosum, again, multiple layers thick. These are the babies from whose parents started in the stratum basale. And these guys are non-dividing. By the time they get to the stratum spinosum, they're just ready to start living their life and aging. But the desmosomes are connecting those guys together. So here's nice picture of that stratified squamous spinosum layer there. And also in this layer you will see epidermal dendritic cells, and these guys are actually immune cells. So they phagocytize. Phago means eat, cytes mean cells. So these are cell eaters, or eating cells, and they are like the Pac-Man that go chomp, 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 and they eat bacteria and viruses that might be trying to penetrate through that skin layer. More detail on the stratum granulosum. So again, these are 3 to 5 layers thick of keratinocytes, and these are aging cells, so now they're just kind of packing away that keratin that they're producing. So that cytoplasm is filling with keratin filaments, and these guys are getting old. They're ready to walk into the sunset. Their organelles are starting to break down. They're just, they're really not doing so good. So the cells themselves are dying, but the keratin's left behind. And thus, we're really starting to see these cells become water insoluble. They're waterproofing. So, again, you can see the very top dark purple layer here would be the stratum granulosum. Whereas down here, a little bit lighter because they're starting to die, is the stratum spinosum, and then the fresh newbies down here are the stratum basale. Okay, then we get to the stratum lucidum. So moving on up towards the superficial layer. Now the stratum lucidum is only found in thick skin, so the skin on the palm of your hands or the soles of your feet. And again, lucidum means light or transparent. So under a light microscope, this stuff just looks clear because the cells are dead, no organelles, no nuclei. They died back in the stratum granulosum. This can be 2 to 3 layers thick. And, again, these are just dead cells that haven't finished releasing the amount of keratin that might be there. So this picture here, you'll see the stratum spinosum, which can be many cell layers thick, stratum granulosum, and then here's your stratum lucidum. So again, you really only see this in thick skin, which is the soles of your feet and the palm of your hands. So no organelles. These guys are just filled with kind of proteins. So here's a protein called eladin. It's basically a intermediate product of keratin. So the keratin hasn't finished maturing yet, and therefore it's in sort of an intermediate stage that is translucent, and that's why there's really no color at all to this layer. It doesn't pick up stain when you stain it to look at it under a microscope. And finally, we get to the stratum corneum. So again, this is basically pure keratin and some lipids there. It's the most superficial layer of the epidermis, and it can be 30 layers thick of dead cells. So it depends on where in the body you're talking about. This is our thick skin here, and I'll just underline that. So thick skin, so palms of the feet, palms of the feet, palms of the hands, soles of the feet. So all of this is your stratum corneum. It is keratin. So it's basically dead cells and keratin. And this layer is constantly being shed. So, you know, if you're constantly scrubbing yourself, you're constantly shedding this outer layer, which, yes, it's possible to take too many showers, because if you're getting rid of this keratinized layer here, you're getting rid of some of your protective function of your skin that will help keep pathogens out. So believe it or not, it is possible to be too clean. But anyway, look how cool it is. I mean, it just looks like a bunch of scraps all stuck together. They're very cool. That is keratin and dead cells. How cool is that? But it's easy to identify under a microscope because it has just this kind of jagged edge here. So you'll know it when you see it. So here is a micrograph. Notice all of this. That is your stratum corneum. So that is that lovely keratin plus dead cells. So the dead cells you can't see because they're dead, so they just show up kind of clear here, but the keratin is totally recognizable. This right here is thin skin, so we don't really see any stratum lucidum here, but check out the stratum granulosum that I'm drawing through right here. And of course, you know, this is your stratum spinosum. And then this last layer down here, notice how in this particular one they're kind of short columnar epithelium. So that is your stratum basale right here. All of this is part of your dermis, so you can see that connective tissue right there. So just a little more about pigmentation in the skin. So this is what a category of epidermal variation. This is your skin color. Well, there's 3 different pigments that can affect skin color. So the first, believe it or not, is hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is obviously the protein that's in your blood, and it accounts for it being red. And so because if you are very light-skinned, you can basically see the pink hue from the hemoglobin. So some people have kind of a pink look to their skin, or even bluish, and that is due to the hemoglobin that's there. And then the melanin, so here is your stratum basale, and you can see that the melanocytes in the stratum basale, which I'm outlining over here, that layer, they are producing melanin. So all of that is melanin produced in the melanocytes. So again, it's an adaptation against UV radiation. Now the other thing that can kind of give you a hue to your skin tone is keratin. So keratin is a protein that we get from foods like carrots and shrimp. And so if you consume a whole lot of that in your diet, it actually changes your skin color. And so you can get kind of a yellow, orangish pigment built up in the skin. And so people that consume a lot of those foods actually have kind of this orangish hue to their skin. There's also strange skin markings that pop up on people from time to time. So one of the common markings is called a nevus. And the fancy term for a nevus is a mole. So, you know, I mean, most of us have moles here and there, right? So here is up close picture of a mole. So that would be a nevus. And basically, it's an area where you had a whole lot of melanocytes growing in one little localized area. So you get a lot of pigment deposits of melanin in that place. That's a nevus. Say nevus. I think nevus sounds cooler than mole. What do you guys think? You also could have a hemangioma. Hemangioma. So this little baby here has a hemangioma. And basically you get a whole lot of blood vessels growing in the dermis of that particular area. And so that produces kind of a red color. So that it's, you know, harmless, but that's a hemangioma. And of course, all of us have frictional ridges, right? These are what give us our fingerprints. And your fingerprints are your identity, right? They can identify a person out of millions based on your fingerprint pattern. So they never tell you it's based on your frictional ridge pattern. And basically what this is your epidermis and your dermis fold in certain ways. You know, you have that papillary layer, and depending on how it's arranged, that's going to give you your fingerprints. So you actually have fingerprints on your fingers, the palms of your hands, the soles of your feet, and your toes. And they're not really there just to allow you to be identified in case you commit a crime. That's not why we evolved frictional ridges. We evolved them as ways of aiding grasping. So it turns out if we didn't have these ridges, I don't think you can see my ridges in the camera, but see if you can see my ridges. But those actually provide, it's protection against slippage. So imagine in the early primate days, you needed to be able to like land on a tree and hang. Those kinds of ridges are going to help increase friction and keep us from slipping off the tree and plummeting to our death. Okay, so that's the epidermis. We had from bottom up, we got stratum basale, stratum spinosum, stratum granulosum. In thick skin, we have stratum lucidum. And at the uppermost part, the most superficial, stratum corneum. Now let's dig down more into the dermis. So that lies deep to the epidermis, below it, right? And we already mentioned that you can divide your dermis into two main regions. So from below the stratum basale of the epidermis on down till you see a change in connective tissue, that is your papillary layer. And everything below that until you get to the hypodermis is your reticular layer. So a papillary layer, a reticular layer. And the papillary layer, you know, you're talking areolar connective tissue mainly, plus blood vessels and nerve cells and glands. The reticular layer, we're talking about, do you remember? Dense, irregular connective tissue. So your reticular layer, just check it out. I mean, you can totally see it, right? Reticular layer is dense, irregular connective tissue proper. You might remember that. So recall that dense, irregular, lots of collagen fibers. It's dense, right? But also a lot of ground substance. And then in this layer, you'll also find blood vessels, glands, usually the base of the glands, hair follicles, nail roots if you're talking about nails, the ends of sensory nerve endings, or sometimes the cell bodies of neurons, and that smooth muscle, the erector pili. This is kind of a cool diagram. They're basically taking the epidermis off of the dermis, and then down here is your hypodermis. Pretty cool, huh? So again, up here would be your papillary layer, this would be your reticular layer, and this is your hypodermis or your subcutaneous layer. Nails. I have horrible nails. But let's talk about nails. So nails are actually part of your integument. Who'd have thunk it, right? So they're actually derived from the stratum corneum. Now this is very interesting. So we already said keratin is found in a lot of places. You find keratin in your epidermis, but it's also what makes up your hair, it's what makes up your nails and the horns of animals with horns. So the cells of your nails are densely packed together and they're producing lots of keratin, and that keratin is going to exist in parallel fibers, and it's very hard keratin. So nails really are a protective function. It's going to protect the cells beneath it. And that's important, right? Because we're constantly using our digits, our fingers. And so you get a lot of pressure, a lot of trauma in that area. You need that hard keratin to protect those areas. And this is from AP Revealed, and I'll show you this in a little bit, but you can actually see the bone inside. So the bone is not part of the nail. The nail is up here. So let's break this nail down a little bit more. So again, it has a protective function for your digits, and we can look at the different parts of the nail. So you guys have all seen that little white, little semi-lunar, semicircular area near the base of your nail? That actually has a name. Lunula. Lune, you know what that means in Latin? It means moon. So this is a lunula, because look, it looks like a little crescent moon, semi-moon. We're going to have around the edge of the nail, the skin kind of folds under, so that is your nail fold, and the actual groove. So this whole part is the nail fold. The groove is your nail groove. The part that sticks over your finger is your free edge. I don't have much of a free edge. People that have nice nails have nice long free edges, at least the ladies. The main part of the nail itself, the flat part, is your nail body. And of course, everybody knows about their cuticles, right? So the fancy term for the cuticle is the eponychium. So that is your cuticle. Okay, so let's look at the parts here again. So the nail body is the flat part, and it's keratinized cells, dead ones. That's why you can cut your nail with nail clippers and it doesn't hurt, because those cells are dead, just like cutting your hair. It's dead. It doesn't, you don't feel it. But that is the main part for protecting your digits. The nail bed is, in fact, I can show you the nail bed a little bit easier on this sagittal picture here. Okay, so this is your nail bed. It's the cells underlying the nail body. And these guys are alive. They're epidermal cells. And what actually happens is, you know, okay, so let's say this is your epidermal layer. You know already that the new cells are in the stratum basale, and they and their babies make their way up towards the surface. But in your nail, you actually, and let me try to erase that mark that I just put there so that we can get a clearer picture. Okay, good. That's much better. So what happens is, as the new cells in the stratum basale of this layer here, this nail bed, as they're migrating up, they start at the base of the nail to migrate over. So they actually start going this way. And so the migration of the nails, of the cells in the nail, go this way on out. And of course, by the time they leave that area, they are dead. But that's kind of interesting that, you know, whereas the skin out here, the cells are migrating this way, when it comes to the part where your nail is, they go right here at the nail root and migrate that way. So the nail root is literally under your cuticle. So if you push your cuticles way down, you're actually exposing your nail root. But that's where those live cells are starting to migrate up through the nail. Okay, so just some more vocab here. Your nail matrix is the thickened growing part of the nail bed. We already said the lunula, or the lunula, however you want to say it, is that just that white proximal area there. And basically what's happening there is the stratum basale is moving up. So these cells are moving that way right there. And so that kind of, because they're all thickening and moving in that one area, they're actually covering the blood vessels that are under there. And so you can't see the pink or red of the blood vessels, so it shows up white. How cool is that? That's pretty cool. Okay, that was nails. Now let's talk about hair. We're just going to get all groomed today. Talk about our nails and our hair. Okay, this is so cool. This is an electron micrograph taken with an electron microscope. I mean, we're talking zoomed in maybe 3,000 times. So, for example, on the big island of Hawaii, there's only one electron microscope on the entire island. How cool is that? So those things can be $1 million to buy an electron microscope, but it'll really let you see what stuff really looks like. And what we have here is a hair shaft, boom, boom, sticking out of this pore here. And then we see the cells around it, like here's a keratinocyte right here. Isn't that neat? That's really cool. So really what hair is a bunch of keratinocytes all kind of just packed up together. They're all dead. When they're in the follicle, they're still alive. So, for example, if you go to a crime scene, forensic biologists or forensic scientists will go out there and they will look to see if they can find any hair. But if they find hair that's just a piece of hair and there's no follicle attached, they can't get DNA out of that. Those cells are dead. There's no DNA. The nucleus is gone. So the only way they can do DNA profiling is if the hair actually still has the follicle attached, in which case the live cells are there and they can get the DNA out. So not too hard to learn the regions of hair. The bottom bulbous part is called the hair bulb. That is going to be in the hair root, is inside the hair bulb, and the long part is the hair shaft. You can learn that, right? Bulb, root, shaft. So here is a micrograph, longitudinal section of a hair follicle. And how cool is this? So this is your hair follicle here. So the very base of it obviously is the hair bulb, and the root is inside there, and all of this up here is the hair shaft. And we'll learn a little bit later about, you know, the glands that are connected to it that produce the oil that will be secreted through there as well. And this yellow one here, it just stained differently, is actual hair. So this is the hair follicle. There's no hair inside of it. this follicle actually has a nice big piece of hair here that's stained yellow. Or maybe the person was blonde, I don't know. Okay, so let's look a little more detail about hair structure. So going from deep to superficial. So the whole thing here, so this whole structure around here is your bulb. So there's your hair bulb. So the whole thing, the bulb. Inside of it, right in the middle, so right here, notice that kind of looks like a nipple. So that is a hair papilla. It's a hair nipple. And the hair papilla is a lot of connective tissue in there, some nerves, and blood vessels. So, you know, when someone pulls your hair and it hurts, that's because you're messing with the nerves that are inside your hair papilla there. So, so that part hurts. Those are living cells in there. But again, the bulb is the swelling at the bottom of the follicle. So the whole thing, the whole space that all this stuff is in, is the follicle. And inside that bulb, lots of dividing keratinocytes that are producing keratin, and that keratin will make its way up the shaft of the follicle, and that's your hair. Now next to this is also going to be an erector pili, and as we said, that's smooth muscle, it's involuntary, and that will allow hair to stand up on end. Probably has kind of an evolutionary reason behind it. You know, it doesn't do a whole lot for us, we humans. You know, we get goosebumps, but for something like a mammal that requires a lot of warmth, like a polar bear, having your outer hairs be able to stand up over your inner hairs, which are really soft, furry stuff, will probably give you a better chance of surviving in really cold temperatures. So it's probably more of what we call a vestigial structure for humans, something that's kind of lost its original function. What else do we have here? So we said our hair papilla, all the stuff inside here. This is called matrix. This part inside of the follicle is your internal root sheath. And then out here is your external root sheath. Sheath just means kind of like a covering. Out here, this, which would surround your hair, is called the cuticle. So you've probably seen this on like conditioner and shampoo commercials, right? They say, oh, use this conditioner and it will repair the cuticles around your hair so your hair is less likely to break and get split ends. Whether it's true with that product or not, I don't know, but the idea is that you do have a cuticle around your hair and that gives it a protective function. And finally, out here, this is your root sheath, and it's made of connective tissue. So those are kind of the anatomy of hair, of the hair follicle. Here's a nice micrograph blown up a little more. So obviously, you know, you got your papillary over here, and you can try to identify all the different parts, which we'll do when we go to AP Revealed. And then we would be amiss if we didn't really talk about these glands. So you might remember from the beginning of the term, exocrine means something where the secretion is put outside the body. Exo means on the outside. Crine refers to secretion. So the two most common types of exocrine glands in the body are sweat glands. And these sweat glands are called Merocrine glands or apocrine glands. So both of these guys are glands that produce sweat. The difference between them is where they produce sweat, and we'll go into some more detail of that in a sec. The other type of common gland that you'll find is called a holocrine gland. It's also another name for it is sebaceous gland. And sebaceous glands, holocrine glands, produce sebum. And sebum is an oily substance. It has some proteins and lipids in there, but it's really oily, and when it gets in your hair, it's kind of nasty. But anyway, that's a sebaceous gland. So your sebaceous glands you're going to find on your face, chest, back, head. Your Merocrine glands you find pretty much everywhere, all over your skin. You can sweat anywhere. That's a cooling mechanism. And your apocrine glands are going to be found in stinky places. Armpits, anus, pubic region, areolar, around the nipples. Yeah, places like that. There are two other types of glands, but these would be considered rare because they're only found in very few places. Curuminous glands or curuminous glands, however you want to pronounce it. These are found in your outer ear because they produce earwax. What produces earwax? Curuminous or Coriomenis, or however you want to pronounce it, those glands. So those are only found in your outer ear. Mammary glands, and those function to produce milk. Now, both males and females have mammary glands. And both males and females have the potential to produce milk. Well, you learn something new every day, don't you? But most males lack the hormones, prolactin and oxytocin, to produce and release milk. Females, of course, can only release milk after they have had a baby and are producing those hormones. But both males and females have mammary glands, so theoretically, technically, we're capable of producing milk. So here are some pictures. So here is a section showing your sebaceous glands, your holocrine glands. And these guys always empty into hair shafts. And so they're producing that sebum, the oil, which will make its way up the hair shaft and out of your body. Here are cross sections of apicrine glands. So these are those stinky sweat glands. Okay, so that's the lumen where the sweat would be released. And here's the cross section of the tubes of the apicrine gland. And notice this is simple cuboidal cells that are actually producing the stinky sweat. Okay, so here's a little bit better look at Merocrine glands. So Merocrine glands are just your general sweat glands, and they're all over your body and really concentrated in your forehead and your palms and soles. So when you get sweaty palms, or there's sweat dripping off your forehead, it's because of all the Merocrine sweat glands that you have. And they're very cute looking because they look like little, I don't know what they look like, upside down lollipops. But they have, here's the coiled tubes of the Merocrine glands, and then they have this nice long shaft where that sweat is going to be, it's going to go up that shaft and out through the sweat pores to the outside of the body to cool you down. So most of the sweat coming from Merocrine glands is water. So 99% water, it's clear, and this is under involuntary control by the nervous system. So your nervous system is going to receive messages from the brain on what your temperature homeostasis is like. Are you hot, are you cold? And if you're hot, signals are going to be sent through neurons to your Merocrine glands, and it's going to say start producing sweat and releasing it. Okay, so these guys are exocrine glands. They secrete the sweat to the outside of the body. So function of the Merocrine glands: thermoregulation, regulate your temperature. Secretion, secrete the sweat for thermoregulation. And protection. Sweat actually does have a protective function. The pH is such and the viscosity is such that it actually will help prevent bacteria and other pathogens from getting in the body. So it kind of has an immune function in that sense as well. Here is a cross-section of apicrine sweat glands. And again, the way to remember Merocrine versus apicrine sweat glands. Apicrine is stinky sweat. So let's write that. Stinky sweat. This is the sweat that you want to put deodorant on for, or perfume. So this is stinky sweat because it's produced in areas where bacteria tend to be present. And so that bacteria is going to like that sweat because it contains a lot of proteins and lipids that the bacteria are going to go yum, yum, yum. So they're going to grow there, and of course bacteria produce stench, and so that will make stinky BO. So apicrine sweat glands produce stinky BO, body odor. So anyway, these are tubes, and the epithelial cells surrounding the tubes, because remember epithelium surrounds spaces, it's going to actually produce the stinky sweat, and it gets released into the lumen. So again, you find these around your nipples in those areas called the areolae around the nipples, your armpits, that are known as your axillae or your axillary regions, your groin, which is your pubic region, and your anal region as well. So that's where you find these apicrine stinky sweat glands. Okay, sebaceous glands are emptying their oily sebum into your hair follicles. So this helps your hair to be nice and lubricated. You don't want it too lubricated because then it just looks like you've been through an oil slick. But this is going to lubricate your hair, including the hairs on your skin, and so that actually gives a nice kind of protective oiliness to your skin, which is part of your protection. And these mostly get going during puberty. So when you're little, before puberty, you don't really produce much sebum from the sebaceous glands. But once you hit puberty, these sebaceous glands start going haywire, which is, why teenagers get the acne issues going on, because the sebum is just going crazy. It's happy to be released after 13 years. So anyway, you start getting sebaceous gland secretions increasing dramatically. And again, these are always found emptying into hair follicles. So here's a sebaceous gland. This is probably all one sebaceous gland. We're just looking at a cross-section of all the different tubes, making it up. But notice how it gets released right into this hair shaft right here. And that oil will make its way out, and then you have oily skin. So here's another sebaceous gland over here, and here's one over here. What you're looking at here are some longitudinal sections of other hair follicles, just so you know what you're looking at. And this is a sebaceous gland. So sebaceous gland looks very different from the other two, doesn't it? And what you're actually looking at here is a cross-section of a hair follicle. So this is a cross-section of sebaceous gland whose sebum secretion will go into the hair shaft right there. So just to sum up the glands of the skin, we have apocrine glands, merocrine glands, sebaceous glands, and then the two rare kinds, mammary glands that produce milk, and ceruminous glands that produce earwax. So this tells you the location of these guys. So apocrine is in the stinky areas. Merocrine is pretty much all over the place, but concentrated, in places that get really sweaty, your palms and forehead and feet. Sebaceous glands are associated with hair follicles, so anywhere where hair occurs, from your face to your scalp to your arms. And then where you're making your earwax is your external acoustic meatus. It means your ear hole. And the mammary glands are obviously in the breasts. So that is the integument in a nutshell. Let's go to AP Revealed. Okay, so we're at AP Revealed. I'm going to pull this down. This time I'm going to click on Integumentary System. And no films in this one, actually. We're going to do some dissections. Hit all content, and let's first look at thin skin and subcutaneous tissues. This is really cool. So this is your first introduction to these virtual dissections. So we're actually going to dissect this person's, this is part of their leg here. And what's cool is as we go through the layers, you'll be able to see on this drawing what layer we're in. So let's, if you just click this, it'll just tell you that this is the person's, epidermis here. So obviously this is the epidermis. So it tells you we are in this region of the skin section. Okay, so now we're going to start to pull this down, and you'll see we're basically peeling off the first layer of the epidermis to reveal what's underneath. So now if we hit layer 2, that will tell us that we are looking at the dermis. So now let's go ahead and see what's under the dermis. Look at that. So here was our epidermis. Here's your dermis. What lies below the dermis? You already know that's the hypodermis. So let's put the layer on there, and you'll see that we are referring to the hypodermis. So we're in the adipose tissue area here. So we have adipose tissue and some loose areolar connective tissue here. So epidermis, and I know you can't see my cursor here, but so the outside was the epidermis, then the dermis, and the hypodermis. Now if we scroll down more, we are unleashing what's below that. So below the hypodermis, what you actually have there is connective tissue. So by the time you're below your hypodermis, you've gotten rid of all your protective layer. Now you're in the meat of the body. And so the first thing you're going to encounter at that point is your fascia lata, which is your connective tissue that is covering your muscles. So again, when you dissect your specimens, like your cats, you'll see all this spider webby loose connective tissue, and that is your fascia. So we're looking at the fascia of the deep thigh here. And you can see it's surrounding the muscles, etc. And we actually end up at the muscle itself. So this is the muscle of, in this case, skeletal muscle from your thigh. Cool, isn't it? I think that's pretty cool. Now let's take a look at your fingernails. So here is your finger, and if I pulled all the layers down, I'd get to the bone. But let's stay with the outside since we're talking about the integument here. And let's take some layers here. So notice that right here is The lateral nail fold, or just nail fold, is fine. Here is your nail body, and there's your free edge. Okay, so we already talked about all those guys, and this actually gives you 2 pictures of that. So if you take the meat away, you can see how it looks with respect to the bone. I think that's pretty cool. And if you take the meat away, you'll also see your eponychium right here, which is going to be under the nail body itself. So notice it says it's the stratum corneum of the proximal nail fold, also known as the cuticle. So let's say that again.
Eponychium.
Eponychium. Okay. Here's your epidermis. There's your dermis. Check that out. Epidermis, dermis. So this is a sagittal cut. Now let's go to our micrographs, and let's take a look at thick skin here, because that's a good example. You can see all the layers in it. And we can either do a low magnification or a high magnification. Let's go ahead and do the high magnification, because I think it'll be easier for you to see the different layers there. So let's first go to our stratum basale. Okay, so there's your stratum basale. Obviously down here is your dermis, so let's highlight the dermis, stratum basale, so you can see the difference there. One up from the stratum basale is your stratum spinosum, so notice it's multi-layers. One up from that is your stratum granulosum, so there's your stratum granulosum. And then because this is thick skin, we can see the stratum lucidum, and you'll notice how it looks much lighter than the other areas. So that's your stratum lucidum. And above that, we have the most superficial layer, which is your stratum corneum, which is up to 30 layers of cornified, meaning keratinized, dead cells. So there's lots of keratin there. This is your keratin layer. So that's pretty cool. Let's go to low magnification, see if we can identify those. So tell me where your stratum basale is. Stratum basale. And this would be your stratum spinosum. And stratum granulosum, and stratum lucidum, and there's your stratum corneum, and this of course is your dermis, so that part right there is your dermal papilla, so you can see the little nipples, right? And down here is your dermis, which is dense irregular connective tissue. If we look at thin skin, low mag, okay, so obviously this is a hair follicle right here. So there's your whole hair follicle. There is your hair sticking out of a hair follicle, your sebaceous glands, the ducts of the sebaceous glands emptying into the hair follicle, and the rest of it's all your dermis. If we look under high mag, well, this is actually just skin here, so you're looking at your dermis, your whole epidermis, stratum basale, stratum corneum, stratum granulosum, because there's no stratum lucidum, right, because we're looking at thin skin, and stratum spinosum. Let's see, let's look at some hair up close. There's your electron microscope, so there's your hair shaft, and a little, these are all keratinocytes right there. So it's a scanning electron microscope, SEM. Low magnification for a scanning electron microscope, but still pretty high. Hair follicle, let's look at low mag. Okay, so there's a whole hair follicle right there, and we can look at the different parts of it. So your connective tissue sheath, so just the whole surrounding the follicle is connective tissue. The cortex of the hair, so that's just where the hair is starting to grow up here, the end of it basically. No split ends right there. Differentiation zone of the hair, external root sheath, so it's the sheath under the connective tissue. A glassy membrane, hair matrix is what we had looked at before, and internal root sheath. Okay, so internal root sheath, external root sheath, connective tissue sheath. So you can see all those. So you can see AP Revealed is a good way to practice these things. Looking under high mag, so here we're basically looking at the hair matrix right there, and the dermal papilla is right there. Okay, so all of that is the connective tissue sheath, dermal papilla, hair matrix, and then we have the dermis surrounding everything, the external root sheath, and the internal root sheath, and the glassy membrane. So those are kind of the parts of the hair follicle. Let's take a look at the sebaceous gland under low mag. So obviously, you guys know where the sebaceous glands are. They're right there. The ducts for them emptying into the hair follicle. Here's the hair follicles itself. Epidermis is up there. The ducts of the sebaceous glands, erector pili muscles. Notice these are all connecting to the hair, so that helps the hair to move involuntarily. And we also have some sweat glands stuck in here. So let's see if you can find the sweat glands. There they are. Okay, so these are your sweat glands stuck in there. Let's see. Oh, and we have a high mag for this. So there's a sebaceous gland up close, and this is a cross section. So there's your hair follicle cross section. There's a cross section of the sebaceous glands themselves. The secretory cells are these cells that produce the sebum, and the ducts of the sebaceous glands going into the hair follicle. Isn't that cool? I think that's really pretty. Let's see. Let's look at a Merocrine sweat gland. Under low mag, so here you've already seen this. These are your Merocrine sweat glands there, and the ducts coming out of them. Notice that these guys, the bottoms of them are in the hypodermis. The epidermis is up there, and the ducts of the sweat glands actually reach the epidermis, and the bulk of the ducts are in the dermis itself. See if we can get a closer look under high mag. So here are cross sections of Merocrine sweat glands. So the lumens are in the middle. Here's the whole Merocrine sweat gland. Here are the epithelial cells that secrete the sweat into the lumen. Basal lamina around there. And that's pretty much what you need to know for that. And what else do we want to look at? So here's a closer look at the ducts of a sweat gland. So this is a Merocrine sweat gland. So that is the duct. Your epidermis is up there, and the dermis is surrounding it. And then here is our apocrine sweat gland cross section. So these are all the tubes that are folded, making it up. And we're looking at a cross section. So the whole thing is the apocrine sweat gland. The epithelia of this gland are surrounding the lumens, so they're producing the sweat, and those are the lumens where the sweat is released into. If we look under high mag, here is a cross section of these tubes, all of the same apocrine gland. So remember when we talked about sectioning, you got tubes folding under, you take a cross section, it's going to look like a bunch of little circles. So notice that we have simple cuboidal cells that actually produce the sweat, the stinky sweat. So these are the epithelial cells of the apocrine sweat gland. Here are the lumens, and here is the whole gland itself. All right, I think we did it all. I hope you have enjoyed learning about the integument as much as I have, and I will see you for the next unit. Take care.